body and bones of a man. The Gospel of John says, He put on the flesh of man, and He made His dwelling with us. That means Jesus actually came as God, and He lived among us. He lived among the lowly. He lived among the people. He came to experience everything you could experience, to be one of us. This gave God a taste of humanity. Something, He created man, but He never knew how to be weak. He never experienced being weak. He knew the knowledge of it, but He never actually was it or in the midst of it. So this gave God a taste of humanity. When God got this taste of humanity, this allowed Him to be able to sympathize with us in our weaknesses, in our struggles, in our failures, just like me and you experience every day. Because Jesus came, God was able to sympathize with us. And because of that, in His relationship, in the way He relates to us, He's able to pour out the amazing grace, the beautiful mercy, and the awesome compassion that He deals with us daily. Because of Jesus, God's able to relate to man with sympathy, with grace, with mercy, and with compassion. And that's one of the lovely things that Jesus has afforded to me and you through Him. Before Jesus Christ came into the world, Jesus always existed, okay? We're going to talk about that. Before He came into this world, so before He was birthed into this world, and before the work He done here on behalf of us, before that, man was very limited in his relationship to God. Man was very limited in the personal experience he had with God, okay? So not everybody had a personal, intimate, and a love relationship with God. Even the ones who seeked it, not everybody was allowed to have a personal and intimate relationship with God before Jesus Christ came. Moses was one of the people... Jamil, why'd you pinch him? All right. Moses was one of the people that was allowed to have a personal and an intimate relationship with God Himself. In the Old Testament, Moses was the man that God used to free the Jews from slavery in Egypt. Just like you see in the movie, Moses, the Red Sea and the whole deal. God used Moses to deliver the people out of Israel. Moses was a friend to God, okay? Or one of the people that was allowed to be a friend to God. Moses one day said, Lord, I want to see you. God, I want to see you. He said, Lord, show me your glory. Show me your glory, Lord. Let me see you. God told him, no man can see me and live. He said, but this is what I'll do for you. He said, I'm going to put you in a crack in a big rock, a cleft in the rock. I'm going to put you in there to protect you. And then as I walk past you, I'm going to cover you with my hand. And when I walk past you, I'll allow you to look at my back. Because if you see my face, you're going to die. So no man can see God and live before Jesus came into this world. Secondly, God didn't speak to the average individual or to the individual himself. There was no direct line from God to you and to me and to everybody in the world. God spoke through a prophet or a big leader like Moses, like Isaiah, like Daniel, like David. He spoke to the prophet, and the prophet spoke down to man, and he taught man what God had told him. So it wasn't like God had a direct line of communication with you. He spoke to the prophet, and the prophet taught and spoke to the people. So there wasn't a line, a direct connection, a direct plug from man to God. It was through the prophet to the people. The presence of God, before Christ came, the presence of God was relatively unapproachable and relatively untouchable. Now we have a church. In the Old Testament times, the Jews had a temple. The temple represented the place where the presence of God was. So somewhere in the temple was the presence of God. The people went to worship, to offer gifts, to do their thing, to pray, and rightfully so. But in the heart of the temple, in the deepest part of the temple, there was a room called the Most Holy Place. It was called the Holy of Holies. And in that room was covered by a curtain. Inside that room was the exact spot that was symbolically represented where the presence of God would be, in that Holy of Holies, which was covered by a curtain. And God told them, don't get confused. I know you know where it is, but don't you dare come in at any time you want. Not anybody on any occasion can come into that room, because if you do so, you will die. The high priest, which was the priest that was chosen to be the top priest, the top guy, could go into that room once a year with fear and trembling. It wasn't like he walked in, hey, Lord, how you doing? With fear and trembling. I heard a message that said, when the high priest went in once a year, they tied a rope around him. They tied a rope around the high priest, around his legs or waist, and then they left the end of the rope outside the room. So as the high priest walked in with fear and trembling, if his sacrifice wasn't good, if God wasn't happy with him, there was a chance that he didn't leave in that room. God would strike him dead. And when the other priests knew that, hey, it's been 4 days, Henry didn't come out yet, what would they have done? They got that rope, they ain't going after him. God said, don't get confused. It's there, but not everyone. It's not an open door. It's not an open throne room. They would drag that priest out of the room by his legs or by his waist, wherever the rope was tied, and he was done, buried, done. So his presence wasn't approachable. His presence wasn't touchable. It was relatively untouchable. Before they had a temple, they had something called the tabernacle. Tabernacle was a box-like structure that had rails and poles attached to it. And as the Israelites moved from town to town, place to place, certain people would carry that tabernacle, and they would move it from town to town. As they moved, it moved. That tabernacle represented where the presence of God would be. So people would pray and worship, but don't touch it. Certain people were allowed to touch the tabernacle. The Levites, the priests, and certain ones. And if you touched it accidentally, you died. You couldn't see God and live. You couldn't speak directly to him. So he wasn't really talking to you directly. He spoke to the prophet. Prophet taught you and spoke to you. You couldn't randomly pop in, hey, Lord, good morning, praise the Lord, and come into the place that represented his actual presence. Don't you get fooled. Don't you pop in. No pop-ins with God. You call first, I'll let you know. You might have an appointment. And don't come touching anything. You touch that tabernacle, if you were assigned to it, that was the end of you. That was the end of your life. So God couldn't see God. You couldn't hear him directly. You couldn't randomly approach his presence. And you couldn't randomly touch his presence. That was a separation between God and